to be the case. If you get a group of coaches together, they're talking about the metabolic energy systems. What repetitions do you do? What interval training do you do? And it's a focus on running, running, and more running. And there isn't much really attention paid to other sources of energy. So biokinetic energy has this ability, because it adds to metabolic energy, it's separate from but adds to. If we increase the amount of energy coming from biokinetics, then we need less metabolic energy for that same speed. Or the performance benefit is for the same metabolic energy, if we increase biokinetic energy production, that adds to the metabolic energy, and the faster you'll be able to run for the same metabolic energy. So biokinetic energy acts to add to whatever the metabolic energy is providing. And at the same time, we're going to look at developing kinetic chain stability. And one of the value-added things about this is that it actually helps to injury-proof the athlete. So it's very, very beneficial in that sense. So we know that materials can store energy. We know that metal springs store energy. We know that elastic bands store energy, and they can release it. And in the same way, the tissues in the body are able to do that. But our understanding of the tissues in the body has changed dramatically in the last 8 years. And why is that? The reason is that for the first time, we're able in research to examine the stresses and strains and what tissues are active in the living individual. Previously, all of the knowledge of the connective tissues and the muscles was looking at cadaver tissue or tissue outside of the body if it was non-human. But cadaver tissue, as we can imagine, is surprisingly unelastic. And so we've had this opportunity over the last 8 years through ultrasonography, through various other techniques, to examine not only the stresses and strains in exercise, but also which tissues are active. And it's changed our thoughts about what tissues do what. So for running, the old idea of a stretch shortening cycle is something which is very much now seen as being incorrect, because there's not enough time for the muscle to eccentrically contract and then concentrically contract, as in the stretch shortening cycle. And instead, we're seeing that for running economy, we're looking at the various tissues which supply the energy return as being the tendons and these new tissues that we've identified, the aponeuroses, which I won't get too stuck down with tonight, but there is the contribution of the aponeuroses is vital. But importantly, it's the tendon and the aponeuroses, it's the elastic properties of those tissues which really determines the improvement of running economy. And so muscles should be in isometric mode through our running and drills. And this is unconscious. We don't need to think about it. If you do the running and the drills correctly, that's where the muscles we now know will be in. They'll be largely in isometric mode. And so the muscle is no longer important as an elastic band. The elastic band is now the tendon and the aponeuroses, but the muscle is vital as a stabilizer and a resistance. So it's not that the muscle is no longer important, it's just that we see the role of the muscle has changed. And so that has implications when we get to consider things like plyometrics. And many of the plyometric drills we do may not be so suitable for running, but they may be very suitable for helping to condition tissues. So we all know that we do things for a variety of reasons when we're coaching. We do some things because it specifically mimics what we're going to do. And then we do other things to provide a basic general conditioning of the tissues involved. Once we've conditioned them, then we can go into more specificity and talk about their role in running. So if we think about the old models of kinetics and kinematics, the comparison from the spring mass model, and this is a well-established model, to look at running as a spring mass model, where the circle there represents basically the pelvis, and the middle here represents when the foot is in center mid support. So when the foot is under the center of mass during running. So when we're here, this is where this position represents, and that's where the spring is compressed. But that's a very simplistic model. And actually, we're talking about biokinetics and biomechanics. And here, if we look at the hip, we've got not only the hip joint involved, we've got the knee joints, we've got the ankle joints, and we've got the big toe joint, the first metatarsophalangeal joint. So we've got the big toe joint, ankle joint, knee joint, hip joint, which is a lot more complex interactions than that simple spring mass model. So for that reason, the spring mass model has lost a lot of credibility. And we're trying to look at athletes now in terms of the reality of their movement and what joints are involved. So let's have a look at what we mean by biokinetic energy.
Only pay for what you need with Liberty Mutual. And
that's not kicked off yet, Peter.
Sorry?
That's not started moving on my screen. I don't know if others...
Right, so I need to activate it. We're picking that up now. Bashir, are we seeing that?
I can see the screen. I can't see any movement yet. And the
no, can you see a picture of Masai warriors?
I can, yes, yeah.
Okay, it's not moving yet. It's just, is it now full screen?
It is now, yes.
Okay, so coaches, what I'd like you to do is just observe this youth in the center here who's coming forward, and we'll watch it a couple of times. So the first time, just watch, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before. So there you saw a young man doing what some people call pogoing, but it's Masai jumping. And this Masai jumping is a ritual that the males do to show off to the females. So it's almost like a mating dance, a pre-mating dance. And they compete against each other. And what I'd like you to do as you watch it through this time is that I'd like you to just count the number of times this young Masai warrior goes into the air. So just count the number of times.
Probably buffering a little bit, that, for me, Peter.
Sorry, Bashir, what was that?
It seems to be buffering a little bit. It's not as smooth as it could be.
Right, I'm continuing it.
We're seeing the key movements of the foot contact and the impressive height that they're reaching.
Okay, we should be back in the PowerPoint now, are we?
Just having an issue with my computer here. I can see the screen. I've got the
We're
Masai
back
Warrior.
into the PowerPoint.
No, I've got the Masai Warrior on my screen.
No, that is in the PowerPoint.
Okay then. Yeah.
So, correct?
Yes, you just turned it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, coaches, just write in chat. I know it was buffering a little bit, but put how many times that Masai Warrior jumped in the air. Now, I can't see the chat, Bashir, so what's coming in?
I'll let you know. Looking for it now. My computer's having a toffee crisp. Okay, the chat, we've got 7 responses, and we've got numbers between 3 and 22. But most numbers seem to be around about 10 or 11.
Right, so I apologize that you couldn't see the video. It must have been buffering, because if you go onto that YouTube coverage, he actually jumps in the air 35 times. So he springs in the air 35 times, just over 30 seconds. So what does that tell us as coaches? Well, it tells us that it certainly can't be ATP-CP work, because it's going well beyond the duration that would allow maximal activity. And so what we're seeing here is biokinetic energy in action. So we're seeing the return of the kinetic energy that's stored within their feet, their ankles, their calves, and very little activity at the knee joint. If we were to watch this from the side, you'd see very little activity from the knee joint, and it's almost all to deal with the foot and the ankle and the elastic tissues involved with that function. So it's all about the kinetic chain. The kinetic chain has been defined as being all of the joints from the tip of the head to the final joint of the toes. That is the whole body kinetic chain. And as coaches, we also talk about parts of the kinetic chain, the lower kinetic chain or the upper kinetic chain. And if you're dealing particularly with throwers, you also talk about the oblique kinetic chains. And we can talk about the posterior, the rear kinetic chain, or the anterior, the front kinetic chains. But at the end of the day, if the whole body kinetic chain is disturbed in any element, then biokinetic energy production is compromised. And so at all times, we can't look really at things in isolation. We've got to look at it in the context of the whole body and looking for that kinetic chain stability. Okay, so what I'm going to do is come out of here for a moment and invite questions for what we've covered so far.
Brian had a question. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, Brian, and
yeah, Peter, thank you very much. Is the link between, I suppose, metabolic energy and biokinetic energy running form in endurance running?
It's part of it, but it's not really. I mean, if you don't have good running form, you know, when we watch our athletes move, we can tell those that have naturally good biokinetic energy. Usually I'll ask an athlete to rhythmically bound 60 meters, say, and just by watching how they move there, I can see whether they naturally have good biokinetic energy contribution or not. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether an athlete has low or high natural biokinetic abilities. All athletes can develop their biokinetic abilities if they do the right activities.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Any other questions before we move on?
I don't think there were. No, not this moment.
Okay, well, let's move on then, and just think about any questions that you have, and we can cover those. We'll stop again shortly and recap and see what questions come up then. So here we are with the kinetic chain, and we've said that we need stability all the way through. Is my volume good, Bashir?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. And we've said that it can't be a partial thing, that we must have control of the whole kinetic chain at all times. And when we think about the activities we do, we think about running. Our goal in running is to try and keep the center of mass from moving up and down too much. So we're trying to keep the center of gravity essentially level. And so whenever our foot contacts the ground, the less it sinks, the better. But it is like this complex biological spring. And we're going to talk about this thing called stiffness. And it's not stiffness in terms of the old term of joint stiffness, where we said, kind of somebody's very stiff because they can't touch their toes. That's not the sort of stiffness we're talking about. We're talking about the stiffness of a system. We talk about the stiffness of a spring-like system, an elastic system. And the closer that is to optimal, the more elastic return we will get. If I can just, I don't know whether this will work. I'll try and show. This is the spring here. I don't know whether you can see this spring, but this spring is quite thin and it gives very easily. So this is not going to return much energy because it absorbs energy, but then doesn't give it back very, very well. It's too soft. In this situation, this spring is much stiffer. And in fact, I can't compress it. And so it can't absorb much energy and it can't return much energy. So in that case, the stiffness is too stiff of the spring. Now, in this case, this spring is strong enough that it will resist, but it will absorb energy and then it'll give it back quickly. And so this would be optimal stiffness. And the body's kinetic chain has the ability to change its stiffness. We know this. So if we increase this elastic return, the less metabolic energy we will need to run at a certain speed. Or again, if we come back to that, the faster you can run for the same metabolic contribution. So that has implications that we can get improvements for our athletes, not just by metabolic conditioning, but we can get significant improvements by biokinetic conditioning. And if you look at athletes like Mo Farah and Paula Radcliffe, they did all sorts of work which would develop their biokinetic energy production and improve their running economy and efficiency. So let's think about stiffness in action here. I want you to think about perhaps being by the sea and being in a car park, and you just parked the car and you're going to run onto the sand. And you run easily across the car park and onto the sand. And when you do that, there's an adaptation. As you're running slowly onto the sand, your legs, your system, your biokinetic system will become stiffer to counteract this compliant, hyper-compliant particulate surface under your foot. So you'll become stiffer. So we know that the biokinetic chain can adapt. And that is a function of, when you're running, the lower kinetic chain with the hip, knee, ankle, and foot joints. It's those activities coupled with the stability of the upper kinetic chain. Because if you've got a well-functioning lower kinetic chain, but you're unstable in your upper kinetic chain, then you're going to lose biokinetic energy. You're not going to be able to get all the energy return you want. So it involves the kinetic tissues, the tendons, and the aponeuroses. Now think about it. If you get out of your car and you're so excited to get onto the sand, you sprint across the car park and you go onto the sand, and there's not enough time in this instance for you to adapt to the new surface. And you might stumble, you might fall. And so we know from this that stiffness is an adaptable quality, and it's also a skilled quality, that if you practice running across a car park on the sand, over time, your adaptation, your stiffness would react a lot quicker. And so we know that the stiffness of the kinetic chain is both trainable and it can respond differently in time. Here's another further example of running stiffness in action. This runner here is perhaps not so well conditioned, and when he finds a softer surface, we all know what's going to happen. He's not able to adapt his stiffness to the surface under his foot. He's been running on a nice path here, a nice trail, come to the mud and the water, and he's not able to adapt to that. But if we look at this athlete, they come in, they react to the new surface under their foot, and they're able to adjust their stiffness and stabilize, restabilize. And so stiffness in action is important, and it allows us to adapt to whatever is under our feet. And that can be the surface under our foot, or it could be changing the shoes under our feet. So if we do have incorrect stiffness, if we're too stiff, so in general, we can say that leg stiffness will increase on softer surfaces and decrease on harder surfaces. We saw with that with the running onto the sand. Running onto the sand, we will get an increase in leg stiffness and biokinetic chain stiffness, and that will decrease on harder surfaces. But if we can't control our stiffness on different surfaces, if our kinetic chain is too often too stiff, then we will be liable to these bony injuries. So if we go back to our spring again, and we have our very stiff spring, if our biokinetics, difficult to get it here. If it's too stiff, then we're more liable, no, not the elastic band shear, but if it's too stiff on the spring, then the bony structures have to take up, and that's where we're likely to get bony injuries. On the converse, if it's too soft, the only way we can get control is if the soft tissues take up control. And so we lose kinetic energy into the squidgy spring. So in both cases, we lose the potential for kinetic energy. But if we're too soft, if our biokinetic chain is too soft, then and our stiffness is too low, then we will get an increased risk of soft tissue injuries. So if we look in whole, if we think about stiffness, it's a responsive, adaptable, qualitative biomechanism involving the joints and tissues of the kinetic chains, and that determines the ability to optimize biokinetic energy production and expression. Various ways, but we can't actually measure effectively whole body stiffness. So that's why I say it's a qualitative biomechanism. You as coaches looking at your athletes will see, you'll know intuitively when you see an athlete able to adapt to what's under their foot and how they move over the ground, you will be able to have that qualitative assessment of their stiffness. And you can observe this. So if we think about summarizing the optimizing stiffness and running economy, we can think about what we do with running on various surfaces. And here we're seeing Steve Ovett running on the sand dunes at Merthyr Mawr in South Wales, with Harry Wilson encouraging him on. Running on surfaces like that is very useful, but also running on cement is very useful, and running on trail is very useful. More variety you have under the foot, the better you will be able to have your athlete develop their adaptable qualities of their stiffness of the biokinetic chain. So coupled with that is running in shoes with midsoles of varying cushioning and thickness. And then we can also do barefoot running. Here, Steve Ovett is running in bare feet, and only a very small minority of runners can actually get away with that. Many times we took athletes to Merthyr Mawr, and these days we encourage the athletes to keep their shoes on, because if they run in bare feet on this particulate sand, they invariably end up with plantar fascia issues. That's the plantar aponeurosis. So the plantar fascia is actually one of these aponeuroses materials. And the plantar fascia, for most young athletes, most athletes these days, is not functioning well enough to permit barefoot running on sand. So you've got to be very careful with that. Varying running velocity, we said that. Generally, the faster you go, the stiffer the kinetic chain becomes. The slower you go, the less efficient. Not overstriding, either naturally or deliberately. That's another important element, and one that we want to kind of look at. So that is just kind of a very brief introduction to biokinetic energy, that we're going to amplify more about what you can do as a coach. But let's pause for a moment and see if you have any questions from there.
Again, I think Brian's got one. He wants to elaborate on the Owen Anderson book. You want to unmute yourself, Brian, and then
Peter, do you know Owen Anderson's book, Running Form?
I'm not so familiar with it. I'm familiar with Owen Anderson, but I haven't seen his book, Running Form.
I think it was published in 2019. He has a calculation of running form. So from a video, he draws a line on a runner from center of the head to the neck, to the thorax, to the hips. And he's looking for alignment there. Is that alignment a way of illustrating the stiffness that you're talking about?
No, it doesn't illustrate the stiffness. No, it just shows a posture, a position.
Yes, I understand that. Yeah.
If you're in that position, Owen might be saying, well, if you're in this position, then you're in the position with the upper kinetic chain to best counterbalance the function of the lower kinetic chain.
Yes.
So he might be saying that. So he might be pointing that position out. And actually, we'll touch on that a little bit, Brian, as we go later into the presentation.
Oh, great. I can't wait. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
I think we've got another question. Again, Kathy, do you want just to unmute yourself and open up?
Yep. Hi, Peter. Hi. My hopefully not too controversial question is about shoes. Are we doing a disservice to our athletes to have them train too often in all the new shoe technology? And in terms of, it seems like it would stop the body's natural need to create stiffness because of the various, the carbon plates, the different technologies that are available now. I don't know if you're going to cover it later, but what do you think about how the new shoes fit in with stiffness?
It's a really good question, Kathy, and it's one we touched. We did a webinar with Athletics Northern Ireland dealing with the rise of the super shoes. And in that, we dealt with carbon-plated footwear. In this presentation, I was not going to deal with carbon-plated footwear because it goes beyond the scope of biokinetics. And you're quite right that my personal position is that athletes should not train in carbon-plated footwear if they're a middle long distance runner or a race walker, but they may choose to wear the appropriate World Athletics approved shoe in competition or for time trials. But if you wear those carbon-plated shoes, this is not what I mean by varying what's under your foot, because the carbon-plated shoes does the kinetic work that the biokinetic chain should be doing. And so you're quite right. I think it would inhibit the optimal development of the individual athlete's own inherent abilities. So that's why I'm very much for suggesting that biokinetic shoes are carbon-plated shoes. It's a shame they came onto the scene at all, but I think there's a great disservice you can do your athletes if they're training in them all of the time. That's where my thoughts are at the moment.
Thanks.
Does that go with your experience, Kathy?
Yeah, I have a few athletes who wear them a little more often if they're particularly prone to injuries, but we're trying to always be heading away from them in training for sure.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good.
Let's, Bashir, we'll go back into the presentation, I think, to move along.
Okay.
Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine. I think I was just going to touch on eccentric stiffness. I mean, my thoughts on the spring is it demonstrates the eccentric stiffness quite well, and I must admit my elastic bands don't necessarily highlight that.
So no, it's not eccentric stiffness. We're getting some sound coming in from somewhere, but it's not eccentric stiffness. Eccentric deals with muscular contractions. And so the terms eccentric and concentric do not relate to anything to do with biokinetics at all. So there are no eccentric movements in biokinetics. We don't use that. We talk about energy return. So energy stored and energy returned. And that's within the spring of the biokinetic chain. If that helps, Bashir?
It does, yeah, it does.
Okay. Excellent, excellent. So we'll move along and we'll say that this free elastic energy can improve running economy. So this is one of the things. We can measure running economy as coaches. We can measure running economy. But what we do not know is whether improvements in running economy have come from improvements from the contribution of the metabolic systems, or improvements from the contributions from the biokinetic energy system, or a combination of the two to a greater or lesser extent. So it's something which is immeasurable. But if at the end of the day, as coaches, we want to improve running economy, so we'll take it, and if we know that it can come from either source, then why would we not work on both sources, both the metabolic energy efficiency and also the biokinetic energy provision? So what we find is that we can get the benefit of both worlds, improve running economy and decrease biomechanical stress and risk of injury. So we're going to look at not how the foot strikes. There's a lot of literature which talks about how the foot should strike the ground. That's very much a natural thing and will change over time. But what we do need to concern ourselves is where the foot is contacting. We should think about how the body is aligned, posture, and Brian touched on that. We should be controlling the kinetic chain stiffness and have adaptable stiffness, so it's adaptable to whatever we're doing. And we should also consider the frequency of foot contact, because that has an impact on improving biokinetic energy production. So here's a diagram from Jay Deshari's book. And here in the center, this is where there is an equality in the foreground to the background of the athletes running. To the left, the foot is striking too far in front. To the right, the foot is striking too far in front. In the center, it's called running in the box, and it's when there's equal front side, backside mechanics. And that is what you're looking for with your athletes. So a very neutral, stable upper body, as Brian was talking about, that Owen Anderson has written about. But that stable upper body allows the lower kinetic chain to function well. So we're looking for a neutral alignment. So we've got to look at our athletes and say, what do we need? We need mobility. We've got to be able to get the thigh behind the hips at leg extension when we're running. We need to have stability. We need to have strength. And here we're talking about developing the glutes, and most commonly we're doing back squats, front squats, overhead squats, but all our squats are glute dominant, which means that the first movement comes from the hips moving down and back. So you'll see a lot of people in the gyms do their squats, and if you watch them from the side, the movement will initiate frequently from the knees and with the knees going forward. And that is a quad dominant squat, which we don't want our runners to do. We want our runners to do a glute dominant squat, which means having the first movement come from the hips moving backwards and downwards, and basically the knees staying stable and not progressing beyond the line of the toes. So doing this sort of squats develops the glutes, and that helps to drive the body upward and forward. And we know from plenty of research that this sort of strength work improves running economy. And generally, when I'm working with athletes, it's 4 to 5 reps of a squat, but with a substantial weight, with probably 80+% of their 5 rep max. And so they're doing a good weight. They're not doing the old fashioned strength endurance, 10 to 15 reps of an exercise, which we get that by running up a hill or whatever. When we go to the weight room is to develop the glutes, and we can do that with squats if we're doing a small number of relatively high intensity, maybe 3 sets of 5 reps at 80% of a 5 rep maximum. And then we can develop the neuromuscular control, the skill of movement, which is really, really important. We need to maintain our posture, and then there should be this unconscious pretension of appropriate muscles. So if you go back to that very early slide, I talked about how the muscles now, we believe, operate a lot more in isometric mode as stabilizers and resistance to the tendons and the aponeuroses. And that is an unconscious pretension. It's not a question of you ask the athlete to think about being in isometric mode. They just are. That's what it is. So those are things we need to develop: mobility, stability, strength, skill. Let's look at mobility. So in general, most runners tend to hit the ground too far in front of the center of mass. That's a common observation. And that will frequently because they don't have enough hip extension. If you can't get the thigh behind you, then you're going to have a premature lowering of the front foot, which is going to allow you to contact the ground in front. So we've got to check whether we have enough functional movement, not passive, but functional movement assessments of these elements: hip extension, ankle dorsiflexion, and big toe dorsiflexion. So here you'll see we need to be able to get the hip behind the pelvis. We need to be able to have at least 30 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion, and we need to get at least 30 degrees of functional big toe dorsiflexion. And you'll note here the toe is being tested with the ankle in a dorsiflex position. Because a lot of athletes, you'll find their big toe wiggles very, very nicely if the ankle is relaxed. But if you put the ankle into dorsiflexion, frequently the big toe will lock and not be able to function correctly. So it has been said in the US that perhaps as many as 30 to 40% of high school athletes have a dysfunctional big toe. It doesn't have sufficient functional movement. For recreational runners, it has been suggested it could be as high as 70 to 80% of recreational runners have not enough mobility at the big toe. So why is that important? Well, the big toe comes into play at toe off. That's this last moment we're in contact with the ground. And here we've got this model of a statue that was made of Steve Prefontaine. And you'll not only see that the big toe joint is working here, but also the thigh is well behind the vertical. If this is the vertical, the thigh, so there's good hip extension. There's good hip extension without having to rotate the pelvis forward to get the leg back there. We want the pelvis in a neutral position. So if we look at that a bit further, why is it important? Well, we can say the ankle needs 30 degrees because this is center mid support here. The foot is under the center of mass of the body while you're running. It's called center mid support. The whole foot is on the ground. So it doesn't matter whether you're a heel striker, a midfoot striker, or a forefoot striker. When you're at center mid support, your whole foot is going to be on the ground unless you're moving very fast. So generally in most middle long distance running, the heel will contact, and it doesn't matter how you struck the ground, this is a common position. Your center of mass will then move forward over your foot, and you want the shin to be able to move. If you don't have sufficient functional flexibility at the ankle, then the heel will lift prematurely. The heel will come up prematurely. So you need that 30 degrees. And then you also need the big toe joint. You need 30 degrees here, because if you don't have that, then we're not able to operate what's called the windlass mechanism. So here, when the foot is on the ground, the foot is pliable, it's conforming to the surface underneath it. As we progress to this point here, then this windlass mechanism, the plantar fascia, the plantar aponeurosis, attaches here on these toes. And so it wraps around the big toe joint, rather like a windlass on a sailing ship. And that tightens the plantar fascia, which lifts the arch, the longitudinal arch of the foot. And it transforms your foot from this soft, pliable foot into a very stable, rigid platform against which to exert force. So you can see that that flexibility is really important there to get the windlass mechanism to function correctly. So it goes back to this whole point about the posture and kinetic chain stability. And it's not just in looking at front, it's the whole three-dimensional movement. So a lot of athletes, if you do a single leg movement like this is a common correction that athletes will give. If they're insufficiently stable or strong enough in their biokinetic chain, they will do a single leg partial squat in this manner. And here you've got internal rotation of the femur. Here you've got medial movement of the knee. Here you've got internal rotation of the tibia and the fibula, all of which are not very good. But the consequence here at the foot is it lowers the longitudinal arch of the foot. And so if you've got a runner who is not very stable, then you see this often in the last 100 meters of an 800 or 1500, where the athletes appear to go flat-footed. And it's because they've lost control of their pelvis. And then when they lose control of the pelvis, they lose control of the whole kinetic chain beneath. And the result is a lowering of the longitudinal arch. So what we're striving to get is this stability here. And I would say myself, if an athlete cannot do this movement and stabilize, then for myself as the coach, I would not do pogoing, any type of pogoing, with double leg even, until they can get that control. Because you would need that control of the lower kinetic chain and the pelvis to be able to stabilize if you're doing any pogoing activity. So we must do that preparatory stability work. So if we think about the pelvis is an interesting kind of structure in the body, and it can rotate around 3 planes. And the rotation around 3 planes is usually because of 3 causal factors, or a combination of 3 causal factors. So we've got the axis which goes down the center of the body, we've got an axis which comes in from the front, and we've got a side-to-side axis. We think about the causal factors. If there's rotation around the vertical axis, it's usually because there's a lack of core stability, or the arm action is over-exaggerated side to side. So if we see movement there, if we see the shoulders perhaps moving from side to side as the athlete is running, it's usually an indication of lack of control and stability in the upper kinetic chain, and it could be a result of arm action as well. From side to side, we're talking about hip flexibility and posture. So if we don't have that hip extension ability, then the only way we can get the thigh behind us is by rotating the pelvis anteriorly, forwards, which is not good. It's not good at all. So we want the pelvis to be in a neutral position all the time. I think many of you have come across that concept of the pelvis being like a shallow bowl of water, and you don't want to tip the water out side to side. You don't want to tip it out front to back, and you don't want to twist the bowl. You want the water, the bowl of water, to be stable. And that's, as you're watching athletes, that's what you should have in your mind, is how stable is that bowl of water. If there's movement in the plane, in the axis that goes from front to back, then that's ground reaction forces. So if you're weak, if you're like that female athlete we saw who was collapsing when she did a partial single leg squat, if your leg on ground contact, if your kinetic chain is not stable, then you will tend to have implications at the hip. It'll either drop or raise, depending on how you compensate for it. So if the hips are moving up and down, if the left and the right hips are relatively moving up and down as you run, then there's instability in the kinetic chain. If your pelvis is moving backwards and forwards around the vertical axis, then it shows that you've got instability. If you watch your athletes from the side and you see when they're doing their faster work that they're rotating the pelvis, then they probably don't have sufficient hip extensive flexibility. So it's working on all of these things. And as coaches, you know, we can tell an athlete till we're blue in the face not to rotate their pelvis. But if we're also asking them to run fast and they have limited hip extension, then the only thing they're going to be able to do to run fast for you is to rotate their pelvis. So we need to go back to always looking for the cause of what we're observing. So we need stability. We've said we're storing energy and we're returning it. If the body is unstable, then the energy stored is lost in that unstable body. If the body is stable, then there's an energy transfer, and all the energy that is stored in our elastic tissues is able to be returned. But if we've got, if you like, energy bleed, if we've got kinetic energy bleed from any joint within the kinetic chain, then we're losing energy. So we must have this whole body kinetic chain stability. That's the important thing. So let me come out there for a moment and take some more questions, if I may.
Peter, it's Michael here. Would you, looking at the dorsiflexion flexion of the toe, the ankle, etc., would you get your athletes sorted or examined by a physio, or how would you recommend that to see exactly how flexible they are?
I'm going to pass that to Bashir to respond to, because I know that both throughout Ireland there are different kind of provisions for this. But Bashir, do we have anything in Athletics Ireland?
I actually missed some of that, so I was just typing something in. Do you want to just repeat that, Michael?
I just wonder how to assess your athlete and how flexible they are, especially around the ankle and big toe. Would you recommend getting that tested with a physio? The athlete tested first.
I think quite often when they go to see the physio normally do those tests on them to see what their range of motion is. But there are easy tests that they can do, whether that's measuring how close you can get your big toe to the wall while also touching your knee on it, and also just following that slide that Peter brought up, you know, about the 30 degrees and the you know, in the big toe and also at the ankle. So they're easily enough done. There are apps on the telephone, and I know the iPhone has got a lot of very useful apps for measuring angles and things. So there are lots of things in your back pocket that are easily pulled out. And I dare say we could, you know, extend this discussion for ideas. But
Yeah. if I'll add to that, Bashir, I think you've covered it really well. That the ankle and the toe are relatively easy for any coach to assess with their athlete. The one that's less easy to assess is functional hip extension. And usually I would suggest that might be something that you work with a physical therapist. And I'm going to refer a book later, Running Rewired, and that has the positions that you need to get into and to be able to have sufficient hip extension. So, and also more importantly, has what you can do if you don't have sufficient mobility. So I think, Bashir, that would be your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. And I know Brian, you mentioned something about DeCarry recommends 2 tools for working on foot strength. The AFX device, which I'm not familiar with, and mono tools, which again I'm not familiar with. I don't know if Brian wants to elaborate, or if you know that.
I think we'll leave that for the moment in terms of bringing new material in, Bashir, if you don't mind. But Brian, any quick comment on that?
Sorry, it sounds like everything you're talking about, we can pretty much see externally by analyzing running form. And a lot of that is what I try to teach leisure endurance runners and new runners in particular. I think it's vital that new runners be taught things like this. But internally, you're talking about, that's something I would love to see analyzed, and I suspect we will in future.
Yeah, at the moment it's very much research oriented, and actually I don't think we need to see that. I think that understanding it gives us a better understanding of what we need to be doing as coaches with the external. But I think that's what you had in your mind, I think, Brian. Yes,
absolutely. And I think you make a good point in one of your published essays about making the link between the science in research and the coach on the field. There has to be something in between that.
Yes, very much so. Thank you for that, Brian. Thank you. So if there are no more questions, I'll carry on.
Yeah, I've got a quick question. Again, second webinar, this is just groundbreaking stuff for me. So here in America, we have 3 different seasons, and I coach on the collegiate level. So you're right, spot on, Peter. We run, and we don't have a chance to break down individual athletes when it comes to form. And Brian, you spoke about video, and we have a very small window to identify, evaluate, and assess athletes. So, we can't do this in the middle of our competitive season. So would it be, a wise coach told me one time, you have to evaluate and adjust the form at a lower speed, and we can't do it so fast. So would you recommend doing this during the off season and just kind of adjusting and tweaking during the early middle part of the season? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Billy, very much for that question. Really good question. And I think it applies in Europe as well, kind of when do you do things? And really, in terms of biokinetics, it's creating the right environment year round. And in terms of identifying then early season, whenever is early season, when you prehab your athletes, when you assess your athletes, and this just becomes part of the pre-assessment, seeing if there are limiting factors there which may affect their biokinetic energy production. But I think, it's very much year round. And as I'll move on to now, it's very much about doing things at full speed. Not doing things. So I do maximal speed work year round after maybe a month of acceleration development before I go into, so my 800-meter runners through to my marathon runners do maximal velocity speed work at least once a week year round. And that is specifically to develop their biokinetic abilities. So good questions, and hopefully some more food for thought here, Billy, and appreciate you being on and joining us for this, and appreciate Athletics Ireland making this open to so many coaches.
Gavin, I'm not sure if you wanted to explain your post there.
I'm going to go into sharing now. I'm going to continue.
Okay.
Yep. So said it's really important to be stable. And then you had a glimpse of this lovely, lovely slide here. So really, when we're talking about strength training, we're not talking about lifting Olympic weights. We're talking about developing the ability for each individual to handle their kinetic chain in a variety of situations and environments. And so, you know, kind of what age should you start training? You would argue that right as early as possible. And then when you talk about doing strength training with Olympic weights, then you can learn the technique of that from 10 years, 9 or 10 years onwards, learning the technique, not lifting heavy weights, but lifting weights which are lifted correctly with squats and so on. And then only when they're in the appropriate strength window would you then think about loading the weights with weights to get strength gains. So strength training with equipment is usually for technique first, and then only for strength gains. And the benefit of that is that when they're ready to lift weights for strength gains, you don't have to learn technique there because you've already learned the technique. So you learn the technique in the skills window, and then you lift for weight later. But it's providing young children opportunities which is frequently lost in school now. When I was in school in 1910, we used to have 3 periods of physical education a week and a double games period as well. So we were forever in the gym or out on the playing fields and doing physical activities. And so everybody learned how to do a forward roll. Everybody learned how to do a handstand. Everybody learned these basic movements which control the kinetic chain. Many athletes now, if you ask them to do a forward roll, they would be aghast because not that they can't do it, but they've never done one. And so, you know, it's the same with a handstand. So let's get on to this and say, well, what can we do then to develop the ability of the athlete? So I led into handstands there, and those of you who've heard me before, handstands, I think, are vital. They help to develop whole body kinetic chain stability. And before a workout, they help to prime the biokinetic energy production. So they help to potentiate the biokinetic chain ready for what is to follow. So the types of handstands we do is largely with coach partner support initially. And you'll see here, this is frequently a beginner with their hollow back and the head out here to give them stability because they're not very stable. And then here you'll see a better handstand. The feet for our athletes, our track and field athletes, our ankle will always be in neutral at 90 degrees. Our back will be as flat as possible. Our head should be in neutral alignment. So we should be looking for this sort of position here. So this is, if you like, the perfect neutral postural handstand where the back is flat, the pelvis is horizontal, the head is in neutral alignment. So if you have your athletes support each other, and I do that, then it's imperative, it's important, it's vital, it's essential that they hold the athlete from the hips, either side of the hips. Never have the person who's supporting grab the thighs or the ankles or calves. That will always lead to unhappy results. So the athlete is always supported by the hips, and you let the athlete come to you. You don't reach and pull them up into a vertical position. So all the athletes I work with do handstands as part of their warm-up, and they usually do them on their own every day. And eventually, they'll be able to get these positions here where the pelvis is in a neutral position, the lumbar spine is in a neutral position, the head is in a neutral position, and the ankles is dorsiflexed, not like this. And the head is like this, not like this. So once you're in this position, then you can start walking around. And so the athletes I work with are able to walk around the infield on their hands, very stable. And it gives them immense confidence when they come the right way up. I've seen their posture improve dramatically without working on it. So that's one of these kind of things that happen because of what you do with something else. So very, very important, I find, to do the handstands. I found that very worthwhile. I've been doing it for years, and I find that any athlete can learn to do a handstand over time. And I've let Bashir have a couple of videos which are very excellent introductions to how to do a handstand safely on your own, using a wall as support, which I don't like people to use a wall without knowing what they're doing, because they will just flop up there and have a very bad position. But the two videos that I've given to Bashir, and I'm sure we can post those somewhere, are a great way for athletes to look at and to introduce themselves safely to doing handstands. So all of the athletes I was working with during the early pandemic had those videos and were safely doing the doing the handstands indoors or in an outdoor covered area. And the only complaint we had was from one parent where the athlete forgot to take their shoes off, and they were kicked up against the wall and were making nice marks on the wall with their black shoes. But apart from that, everything went very, very well indeed. And I'd said to them, you should do it in bare feet, not with shoes on. So the other thing we really need to work on is running for speed. Running, because the faster you run, if you think about it, think about our friend the kangaroo. When the kangaroo moves slowly, it uses what's called a pentapedal gait. It uses its forelegs, its hind legs, and its tail. And it moves around in this pentapedal gait. And the kangaroo is incredibly inefficient metabolically. But when it gets up onto its hind legs, it starts beginning to use more and more biokinetic energy. And then when a kangaroo is moving at full speed, it's a paradox. The faster the athlete runs, the less metabolic energy it uses. And that sounds almost counterintuitive, but these kangaroos in Australia can cover 70 to 100 miles at 20 to 40 miles an hour just by hopping. And that's certainly not because they're using metabolic energy, it's because they're using biokinetic energy, in this case within their hind legs, their lower kinetic chain. And so it's an excellent example of how by running faster, we're going to get quicker ground contacts, we're going to get more elastic return, we're going to develop the ability to optimize stiffness, and it's going to contribute to better running economy. So here we've got standard flying 30s, where there's always a 30 meters maximum acceleration. And that's why, Billy, I was mentioning we need to have the athlete be able to accelerate to maximum at 30 meters before we can go on to flying 30s. So that usually takes 3 to 4 weeks coming back from a rest. And then you hold your maximal speed, you hold the frequency of movement, the rate of movement. Remember on an earlier slide, I said that we're going to need to consider how often the foot should hit the ground. And we need this frequency, this high frequency of hitting the ground. And then your athlete should take up to 30 meters to decelerate. So deceleration is where injury can occur if you put the brakes on, if you lower the center of mass and slow down by braking. So it's always just, I ask the athlete to maintain their hip height and just shut the engine off. So don't touch the brakes, but just shut the engine off and slow down slowly, decelerate slowly. So flying 30s are a standard for developing maximal speed running, but also develop biokinetic abilities. And for a sprinter, you'd probably do 3 sets of 3 repetitions of flying 30s, 2 to 3 minutes between each repetition, where you walk back, and 5 to 7 minutes between the sets. So this quality of work is not fatigue resistant. So you don't do much of it. And for a middle long distance athlete, race walker, I would rarely go to 3 sets. I'm more likely do just 2 sets if I'm working on this. 2 sets of 3 is plenty if I'm going to do other work afterwards. If I'm working with a sprinter, the 3x3 by flying 30s, that might be the whole session. And they cool down afterwards because you're working the ATP-CP system very, very intensely. You're also working the psyche, the mental concentration, and the ability to focus on maintaining this maximal frequency in this zone here. So that's really important that we maintain maximal frequency. So if you've got an athlete who's a lower training age or less experience, then this middle section doesn't have to be 30, it can be less. So it might be you do 2 times flying 10s for a beginner athlete. So you do maximum acceleration for 30 meters, and then just 10 meters of holding frequency, and then up to 30 meters of deceleration. And then that might increase to 20s. But as coaches, you're probably working with groups. I certainly do. And so I developed my flying 10 to 30 meter training grid. And so on the back straight, I'll mark out, I'll put cones at the beginning here. I'll put cones after 30 meters. And then in each lane, I'll put a cone at 10 meters, 15, 20, 25, 30 meters. And then I'll put cones for 70, 75, 80, 85, and 90. And I can work with a group of varying ability. And I always start with what I know they can do. So I wouldn't put them all in the flying 30s and say, well, you can't do that, so go to 25. You can't do that, go to 20. I'll put everybody, depending on their performance abilities, maybe say flying 15s. So everybody does flying 15s. Those who are able to maintain their frequency well may try flying 20s. And the advantage of this grid as well is that during a session and during a set, if the quality of holding the frequency diminishes, I'll either stop the activity or move them to a lesser amount of flying speed, their maximal velocity. So you've got this ability to move the athletes around within the grid during training. Here's an example of a session where I might incorporate that. So here I'm doing 2 sets of 2 times flying 20s, and that's for both ATP-CP training, and also I'm priming the stiffness. I'm activating the adjustable stiffness for what is to follow. And then might do some easy running, and then some VO2 kinetics activators that I talked about last Friday, and then into some fitness work. So that could be a session for a middle distance runner where you're blending, developing stiffness, optimal stiffness in the early part of the session. You're also getting some ATP-CP training, and then that's helping to prime for whatever is to follow. And the more you vary the running speeds, the more you vary the stiffness, because stiffness changes according to your running speed. So if I was doing this, I actually probably would do 2 sets of 4 times 200, 3K pace, 1500 pace, 3K pace, 5K pace. So I would vary the paces of each repetition. So in that way, I'm actually asking the athlete to run at a different speed for each rep. And the consequence of that is they're going to have a different stiffness in each of those elements. The consequence of that is they're going to be creating metabolically different amounts of lactate and training their body to use it. So this is truly where you're actually blending metabolic training and biokinetic training together in terms of optimal stiffness and optimal lactate aerobic interaction. So these are the books I'm referring you to. The one I'd really recommend to everybody is Running Rewired. That's the latest book, and it's got lots of exercises to use, really informative. If you use that with your athletes, you won't go far wrong. The earlier book was Anatomy for Runners, which is a lot drier, but if you're a physical therapist, you might find that kind of more interesting or a useful additional book. And a heads up that Anatomy for Runners is available on Amazon. And that book was released in Europe as Run Like an Athlete with a different title. And it's the same book, but Run Like an Athlete is a different format. and I would recommend getting Anatomy for Runners rather than Run Like an Athlete. So those are two books I'd recommend: Running Rewired and Anatomy for Runners. But if you're only going to get one and you're a coach, go for Running Rewired. So as coaches, let's just remind ourselves that we've talked a lot about the what of coaching tonight, but it's how you individually put it into practice in your sessions when you're with your athletes. And it's trying to create that environment all the time and saying, what are the outcomes I'm looking for here? How can I help the athletes to experience and to gain what they need? And for those, it's not who you coach, it's how you coach them. I know a lot of really, really excellent, some of the very, very best coaches are working with athletes who may not be very gifted athletes, but they're helping those athletes reach their own genetic potential. And that's what each of us as coaches, some of us will be lucky enough to have very talented people come our way, but that doesn't necessarily make us a better coach. So it's not just who you coach, but it's how you coach them. So I think what I'd like to do is go into a last set of questions here, just very brief questions, if there's anything there, Bashir.
Peter, Michael here again. So just to summarize, would you say running stiffness is mainly comes about by different velocity of running, and then the handstands seems to be the thing that you're going for, which to my mind looks like a plank for the whole body. And then I'm not too keen though on running on concrete because I think that induces injury. But so would you say that the main one is just the handstands, the Masai jumps when they have stability, and then running at different velocities?
I'm not recommending the Masai jumps.
Are you not?
I want to make that clear. I'm using that to demonstrate those people have been doing that for years. And I think if coaches were to try and introduce that, there's a very high risk of not good results. I think there's other things we can do. Running on concrete, if an athlete gets injured by running on concrete, then it indicates that they don't have the ability to adjust the stiffness of the biokinetic chain. It shows a weakness. And if you're planning on running, say, for example, the Houston Marathon, which is all on cement, then you're not going to have a very happy outcome. So it's variety. We need to, I developed a 1,000-meter warm-up loop for high school, where within the 1,000 meters, they run on soft grass, muddy grass, they run on gravel trail, they run on the back straight of the track, and they run on cement. So they're running on those 4 different surfaces as they're warming up. And really, it's a question, if you're an athlete, we should not be afraid of cement. It may be counterintuitive, but if you run on soft surfaces all the time, you're setting your athletes up to get injured because they will not optimally adapt their stiffness to different surfaces. So it's not just the surfaces, it's also the terrain. When we run uphill and downhill, stiffness changes. So we understand now why we need this variety if we're going to provide the environments for the athletes to optimally develop their biokinetic energy capacities. And I talked last week about varying the shoes you use during the session. So maybe starting your warm up in the more cushiony shoes, doing a little bit of flying 20 work or whatever in your spikes, and then putting your racing flats on for the reps, and then going back to your other shoes. So you've got 3 different types of compliance under your foot there. And each of those, your athlete is going to be adapting their stiffness to whatever is happening under them. So don't be afraid of cement. If your athlete is well-trained, well-conditioned, cement is less of a risk in many ways than running on trail.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you, Peter.
Peter, I have a question. Gavin Boyce here.
Hi, Gavin.
My question is, how do you get around the mental block? Like, I don't like running on trail. I don't like running cross country. I have to do it, but I can't get it into my head. Even when I train on it, I still can't get the body to adapt the same as it would on the road. How do you get around that, or what can I do to get the stiffness that you talk about?
Because it sounds, Gavin, with respect, that because you don't like it, you perhaps don't do enough of it.
Right, that's quite possible. I can avoid it if I can, yeah.
So I think really, you've got to put yourself in that environment, 2-3 times a week, and
Right.
and then you'll get the ability. Your body will be able to. I mean, I remember a long time ago, I got a pair of training shoes when Adidas switched from Mexicanas, which were very soft, to the SL72s, which were very hard. And I put the SL72s on. And I thought I could never train in these.
Mm-hmm.
And within 3 weeks, they were the best shoes I've ever had. And my foot contact had changed with the ground. And I literally flew in those shoes. And so if I'd taken my first reaction, I would have thrown them away. But I persevered because I didn't have the option of buying another pair of shoes. And in the end, my stiffness adapted to it and actually benefited by having that change of footwear.
Right. Another question now as well when you're there. See, with every pair of runners that I have, the big toe comes out. So is there a breakdown of my kinetic chain from the foot up, or what causes it? Is that part of
So your big toe
comes out through the runner? So I'm over thingman 30. The angle's greater than 30.
I doubt it. Without looking at it, Gavin, I can't really advise, but it may be that your shoe is not fitted well.
No, they're fitted all right. It's just every pair I get, the toe comes out, and I'm just thinking, is that my chain? Then I'm over thingman the 30.
Which
the
brand
angle
are
of 30.
you using? Which brand?
New Balance.
New Balance. Okay.
Doesn't matter what I wear.
I would talk. You've spoken obviously to the store about that.
Yeah.
What's their thought?
Oh, they just store's a store. They're just selling them. They don't care. They're making money. They're happy seeing more money for them.
Without seeing them, I can't really comment. But I would have a physical therapist do an evaluation on your big toe flexibility and see what they think.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. No, thank you.
Peter, I have a question. An athlete who's been recommended orthotics, she will be flat-footed. She has actually one big toe which curls outwards. Now she'd be a good athlete. She does a lot of her foot exercises, but she will predominantly train on grass. Now it would be grass that gets hard, so there would be a variety of surfaces in the grass, but she wouldn't be on roads that much. Any views on, should she just persist, not wear the orthotics and try and correct the imbalance in the foot, or are orthotics a solution? Maybe it's not your area, if you want to pass.
No, it is my area very much. And, it depends on if you've got an issue with the big toe. And I did design work. I'm no longer involved with the company Hoka, but I did design work for them for several years. And Hoka shoes benefit by having a very stiff midsole. And initially, the Hoka shoes were marked down by Runners World because one of their criteria was for having a very flexible midsole, where they would take the toe and bend it back to the shoe and see how flexible it was. And Hoka's weren't flexible, and so they got marked down. And then they realized that actually Hoka's have got this rocker action where the foot rolls over. So the Hoka's, if you like, is the holy grail, because if your big toe doesn't function, it'll do the work of the big toe. And if your big toe does function, it allows it to function within the shoe. And I had the experience of 3 of the athletes who I coach who they were told they had to wear orthotics. And they, without talking to me, 2 of them, without talking to me, just on their own, experimented And in the Hoka shoes, they were able to run without orthotics, because in the Hoka shoe, the foot sits in the midsole, not on the midsole. And so this acted as a neutral orthotic and gave them the support that they wanted. So a lot of physical therapists in the US recommend Hoka Bondi shoes for athletes who have plantar fascia problems, who have big toe mobility problems. So Catherine, to give your athlete kind of encouragement, there was a young woman in Scotland who I knew, who was a junior international cross-country runner, and both her big toes crossed over her second and third toes.
Okay.
And she was prescribed, when Nike came out with a shoe which had a split, it had the big toe split from the other toes. And so she would wear those around the house to kind of to help. And it did help. But at the end of the day, she compensated for that. And even having these big toes kind of crossing over the adjacent toes, she was able to run very, very well internationally.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, no, good luck to her.
Thank you.
Any final questions or thoughts?
Peter, Jim Davis here. Currently, I find there's a lot of emphasis on strength and conditioning. But one of the problems I find here in Ireland anyway, there are a lot of the people who are so-called strength and conditioning coaches don't understand running. And obviously what you have told us early on tonight is, in my opinion, is excellent. But I find that a lot of these strength and conditioning guys are guys who are involved with rugby teams, are involved with gyms, and they don't understand running at all. And athletes are given exercises which in some cases, I know myself, have caused serious injury. And in fact, one athlete, a very promising athlete I coached, gave up his athletics because he got a tendon injury because of the particular exercise he was doing. And when I said it to the strength and conditioning coach, he contradicted me, dismissed me. And I do remember being at an IAAF Elite Academy course in Lockbury, and you were there yourself. And one of the things that was said there, and it was said by yourself, that all of any exercise the athletes would do would be conducive to running, that was suitable to athletes. And I find that a lot of the what they call it, the guidance that's given by people in strength and conditioning is not suitable to athletes, in my opinion. And athletes have caused injury. Have you found this yourself?
I think it's a valid observation, Jim. And I think that, you have to, as a coach, I would never give my athletes to a strength and conditioning coach. I would work with a strength and conditioning coach if I felt they had something to bring to the table. But really, I take from people like Jay Deshari. I'm very fortunate I can collaborate with him and produce programs for my athletes, which I innovate myself, but also I take a lot of advice. I listen to a lot of people and I filter a lot of these things. And at the end of the day, as a coach, I want to be able to work with a lot of those activities myself. And so I don't have a separate strength and conditioning person work with the athletes. I develop my own programs over time, and I know not all coaches have time to do that, but I think you're quite right that you've got to be very careful. It's got to be very much assess the strength and conditioning person and make sure they're singing from the same hymn sheet that you are.
Thank you.
Peter, can I just add on that, Peter? In my experience, sometimes the athletes, some of the higher performing athletes, they're so focused and dedicated, but sometimes they overdo it with the strength and conditioning, and they just work linking hard, and they don't necessarily address the correct technique for the strength and conditioning that they're actually doing, and they become injured, sometimes out of frustration rather than, fluid focus that we would want them to have. So that's happened with a couple of athletes I've worked with, but they just overcooked it in the cross training.
That's why I like to monitor that myself, so I can assess the whole training load, not just kind of take, oh, they've done this and they hand it back to you and you're not really aware of what they've done. But I'll move to a quick summary, if I may, Bashir, and then let you kind of close the affair down. Unless there's any other questions.
I'm not sure if George or Mike wanted to jump in with all those points. Talk about flying 30s for marathon runners and the appropriateness of it. Would you do that?
Sorry, what was that question?
Yeah, from Georgie Silva. He was asking, would you recommend the flying 30s for the marathon runners?
Yeah, certainly, George. It's something which from 800 meters to marathon, because it has this ability to develop the biokinetic input. Again, why would you not do it with your marathon runners? If your marathon runners can't sprint fast, then they're missing part of the armory of their development as an athlete. So they may not be able to move fast as Usain Bolt, or for take a female counterpart as well, take shippers. They may not be able to move as fast as that, but the whole point is they'll be able to improve their speed. By improving their speed, they'll improve their biokinetic contribution. This will help improve their running economy, which will help improve their marathon time. So it has consequences all down the line.
Thank you, Coach. I have a question for you about the warm-up. For example, we do the warm-up aerobic section, maybe 10 minutes after I will go to the handles, and after the handles to activate the muscles, and after if it's possible, I do the flying, this flying section with the marathon runners, because I have attention about the injury in the marathon runners, because don't training all the time the fast fibers in this section, because they do a long runs and this.
Right. I think it's a
what do you suggest?
George, I'll invite you to stay on a little bit afterwards, because I'm going to wrap up now, if I may, Bashir, with a summary, and then let people thank everybody for their involvement and apologize again that we can't have more interaction. I would love to be in a room with all of you. I'd love to be in Ireland enjoying the times there. But I'll just wrap up with a final summary of what we covered tonight. So this is something to reflect upon. There's no right or wrong answer, but consider whether your athletes, not how you would describe yourself, but how your athletes would describe you, whether you're a process-focused or an outcome-focused coach. Process-focused, responsible for creating the environments, in training, looking for rhythms and paces rather than shouting out times. Shouting out times would be an outcome-focused coach, where the coach only has in mind of what's going to be the end, and not making the means necessarily the focus. So consider whether your athletes would describe you as a process-focused or an outcome-focused coach. All of you, I think, understand the patience. You need a lot of patience. Having said that, it's like anything. The longest journey starts with but a single step. If you say, well, my marathon runners will never be fast, therefore we're never going to do any speed work, they never will be fast. That becomes a self-fulfilling philosophy. So if you're patient and you work, it may take years, but you will find that your athletes will improve. You get these slow, imperceptible accretions of improvement. And like I say, we don't know when our running economy improves, we don't know if that's come from metabolic improvements or biokinetic improvements. I don't care, I'll take it, because I know I'm working on a balanced development of everything, and it takes time. Take into account in your planning both the bioenergetic and biokinetic sources of energy. And as you've seen, as you've observed, a lot of what we do helps specifically to develop the biokinetic energy sources, but also has the added value of developing our bioenergetic, our metabolic energy sources. So many times the work we do, the environments we create, help to stimulate both. Having said that, we need to create times where we're really focusing on the tissues involved in giving elastic energy return. We need to develop that stability of the kinetic chain all the way through. so we don't have a leakage of kinetic energy. And we develop this awareness, or as I've said here, is unawareness. So initially, we need athletes ideally to be in the correct posture without thinking about it. They should be in the correct posture unconsciously. So if you like, develop a focus on posture, which is an unfocus on posture. Again, it's one of these paradoxes, unconscious consciousness. So you want good posture, but you don't want the athlete thinking about it because they're thinking then about something they shouldn't be thinking about. Coach the athlete always and not the event. If you develop your athlete as a runner or a race walker through all the distances, then they will, in their own time, find the distance which is best for them. So always coach the athlete, not the event. And finally, a platitude. If you enjoy your coaching, your athletes will as well. And I think, we're privileged to be in the position we are, to work with usually young athletes, but not always. We're working with masters, but working with people who are concerned with their own development, their own improvement, and we have that privileged responsibility. So hopefully enjoy your coaching and remember to always enjoy it, which is difficult sometimes, but smile through it. Thank you very much for your attention tonight. Really appreciate seeing you all out there. And like I say, I apologize that we can't actually have an opportunity to meet face to face at this time.
No, that's absolutely brilliant, Peter. Massive appreciation. I'm sure the people listening to you will appreciate some great explanations, some great diagrams and slides, and we will send them in good time to you. And as I've said, the presentation will be available in the near future, hopefully by the end of the week. Thanks again, Peter. Absolutely spot on.
Thank you. Good luck to all the coaches.
I'm sure they'll do a great job. And I'll see a lot of you out and about over the summer. Thanks again.
You're welcome, Bashir, and we'll hang on and see if there's anybody with dying questions.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if Mike wanted, he had a question. Maybe are they all waiting on this final question?
Yeah, yeah, if anybody does have a question, feel free to unmute your mic and ask the question.